All right, we're 3 minutes in and the participant seems to be slowly leveling off. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really look forward to the conversations we're going to be having today on landfill methane emissions in California and some of the work that we're doing to better understand and mitigate those mitigations, specifically how we're using ambient measurements in different ways. So we have a great list of speakers from CARB and CalRecycle coming up. But before we get some opening remarks, just some general housekeeping. This is an online meeting only using Zoom. If you are having some difficulties, you can use the Q&A window to send a question to our staff, and then we'll then respond to you, trying to help you out with access, etc. Your question and the reply will be just between you and staff. The chat feature is disabled at this time. If you have questions for the panelists during the time that they're giving a presentation, you may also submit those using the Q&A window. And you can submit those at any time. The Q&A will be monitors for technical questions, and if they can be answered quickly with the Q&A function, they will be answered using the Q&A function. And at the time that they create the answer and post it, at that time it'll be visible to everyone. Once we get to the Q&A sessions, we'll open up the ability to make comments verbally, etc. So with that, we're going to start out with some opening remarks by Matt Patil, the Chief of our Industrial Strategies Division. So take it away, Matt.
Thanks, Jorn. I want to make sure that I'm up. All right. Thanks, everybody. So it looks like we have a little over 200 attendees today, which is a great turnout. I just want to express my appreciation for everybody spending part of their morning and afternoon with us today. And so, I am the division chief of the Industrial Strategies Division, and in that capacity, I help oversee our scoping plan work, our low carbon fuel standard and cap and trade programs, as well as our work on short-lived climate pollutants. And as many of you know, the landfills are the second largest source of methane emissions in California behind dairies, and we've been working collaboratively with CalRecycle to reduce these methane emissions over the past decade. And part of that means the development of our landfill methane regulation that we adopted in 2010 after the 2007 scoping plan, as well as the incentives that the state provides via the Budget Act and the low carbon fuel standard to reduce methane emissions. And as we've worked to implement these 1383 programs, we've continued to receive questions about landfill methane generation and recommendations on how to accelerate progress on methane reductions in California. So many of you also probably know that a few weeks ago, ISD staff published the final scoping plan, where in it, we make it clear that in order to achieve the SB 1383 requirements for methane reductions and organics diversion, we need to continue to expand the diversion infrastructure in California and also improve mitigation in existing landfills. And so while the scoping plan outlines the steps we need to take to reduce landfill methane emissions, there continues to be ongoing questions around how much methane emissions are generated from landfills and how different conditions contribute to that methane generation. These questions have come up both around our overall landfill methane inventory and also how we estimate things like avoided methane crediting in the LCFS. And so today's workshop is an opportunity for CARB staff from multiple divisions to outline the extensive research and measurements we've undertaken over the past few years to better understand landfill methane emissions. It's also an opportunity to hear from everyone in attendance on other data and studies that exist that can help us better understand landfill emissions and their causes. And if you take away just a few things from today, it's this. Creating precise estimates for landfill emissions is a challenging endeavor, given the variability of landfill conditions and methane generation inputs. But despite the challenges in precisely estimating emissions, California is committed to reducing landfill emissions through strategies targeted at both organics diversion and landfill gas capture. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Jorn from CARB's Research Division, and I think he is going to give us the first presentation. So Jorn, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt. Appreciate that. So I thought we would start off with just at a really high level, why are we so interested in methane and what's going on? And then we'll have subsequent presentations on the specifics of the research that we've been doing over the last decade to better understand and mitigate methane from landfills. So why methane? Well, it's a very important greenhouse gas, and also it's a short-lived climate pollutant. Uh, in both the California and other inventories, such as the US greenhouse gas inventories, methane accounts for about 11% of total greenhouse gas emissions. But that really doesn't tell the whole story. Methane actually accounts for about 30% of the global warming that has occurred to date. And this discrepancy is because the warming that occurs from methane happens at a different time and at a different level compared to CO2. So there's kind of two things that we talk about when we talk about relative warming from short-lived climate pollutants, and that's the global warming potential. Most of you are probably familiar with this term. The 100-year global warming potential for methane is 25, and the 20-year global warming potential of methane is 86. So when methane is first emitted, it warms considerably more than CO2. But at the same time, it's removed from the atmosphere more quickly. So a pound of methane emitted today, half of that will be gone after 8 years, and then 75% will be gone after 16 years, et cetera. Carbon dioxide is much longer lived, and so you only remove half after 53 years. So it's just a lot slower. So these are kind of the metrics that we talk about, but I kind of wanted to go back for just a second to first principles and see what is actually happening. How much is methane warming the atmosphere, and when does it do so? So this shows if you emit the same amount of methane and the same amount of carbon dioxide, when is that warming occurring, and what is the strength of that warming? So on the y-axis, you have the relative atmospheric warming, where the amount of warming occurring by carbon dioxide at year 1 is set to 1. And so you can see in year 1, methane warms the atmosphere about 130 times more than carbon dioxide. But also, again, methane is short-lived, so there's a very quick drop-off in the warming, and you get these reductions in total warming from that methane relatively quickly. And here, a different view of that. This is how much methane is, how much CO2 and methane is remaining versus time. And that's that removal rate that we're talking about. And you can see, after, for example, 60 years, almost all the methane is gone, but close to 50% of the CO2 is still there. So these two things in combination lead to the important conclusions that many of you are probably familiar with. Reductions in methane will lead to relatively quick reduction in warming, especially compared to reductions in CO2. And then we really need reductions in methane to allow for the measures we take on CO2 to actually affect reduced warming, because it takes so long, because CO2 stays so long in the atmosphere. And so not just California, but the world is starting to really pay attention to this and realizing that this needs to happen. The UN and Climate and Clean Air Coalition recently released the Global Methane Assessment, in which they quantify what are the emissions, what are the emission sources, and they lay out really the case for why we need to make these reductions now. And they conclude that fast and ambitious methane mitigation is one of the best strategies available today to deliver immediate and long-lasting multiple benefits for climate, agriculture, human, and ecosystem health. And then the US government has also started the worldwide global methane pledge, in which countries sign up to reduce their methane emissions about 30% from today's level by 2030. And so I think 130 countries are signatories to this pledge at this time. So there's a lot going on internationally on methane because of the reasons that we just laid out before. And so in California, we've been working on this for a while, and we both have a short-lived climate pollutant reduction strategy plan that was reduced 5 years ago now. And then, as Matt mentioned, we have our 2022 scoping plan for achieving carbon neutrality. Senate Bill 1383 requires that we reduce methane by 40% from 2013 levels by 2030. And it also requires that landfills divert 75% of their organic waste by 2025, I believe it is. And one of the take-home conclusions of these various reports, research has shown that landfills are complex systems, and a wide range of conditions may contribute to variability in rates of organic waste degradation, methane generation, and capture efficiency. And so some of the work we've been doing in the research division using ambient measurements is trying to shed some light on this. What is the variability? What is the emissions, et cetera? We don't have a complete picture yet, but we have a lot of information, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So to make these measurements, we avail ourselves of a number of different methods, and they're kind of shown in cartoon fashion here. We're using most of these in our research in understanding methane emissions broadly and specifically at landfills. The important thing to note is that there's no single measurement that will tell you everything that you need to know all the time. Each different measurement is good for a specific purpose, and you learn something from each of them, but you really need to consider them all in order to have a complete picture. And we have a lot of these individual measurements made, but we don't quite have the complete picture as well. I also want to point out that there are measurements that are made for different purposes. Some are really good for monitoring total emissions at a specific point in time or space. And other measurements are better for achieving mitigation. Sometimes these can inform each other, but they're not the same. They are different. And so the Air Resources Board, of course, has a research program specifically to landfill methane. Every 3 years, we put out a triennial research strategic plan, and we're currently operating under the one that covers the years 2021 to 24. And there is an emphasis in that plan on better understanding greenhouse gas emissions, such as methane. And there are 2 specific questions that we've laid out. What are the greenhouse gas emissions trends for specific sources, such as landfills, and how can they inform future greenhouse gas policy? And how can new technologies such as remote sensing that can pinpoint individual leaks be used to achieve further methane mitigation? And so we'll go through the things that we're doing to answer these research questions today with specific technical presentations. And again, just want to hone in on the fact that our current methods for observing methane emissions from landfills, they're all important and they all have their specific purpose, but we still do not have a complete picture, and we hope to discuss with you next steps at the end of this workshop for next steps in terms of research. All right, and so with that, we're going to get into the specific work that we've done. And for that, I'll ask Dr. Matthias Falk to first present on some of the work that we've done using ambient measurements to quantify methane emissions from landfills. Matthias?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Matthias Falk. I work here at the research division on methane emissions research ranging from ground-based measurements all the way up to our satellite program. To continue where Johan left off, we really have research efforts ranging from ground-based things like towers to airborne measurements, all the way up to large-scale modeling studies and even satellite measurements. So, and in this following presentation, I will show a range of these and the state where they're at and what kind of results we've gotten from them yet, and maybe discuss a little bit about future directions of how we can learn from each one of them, weaks and strengths and weaknesses, and continue to get to the answers that we need to address methane emissions in the future. So first, we're going to focus on some of the atmospheric inversion models. These studies, these take atmospheric measurements and go all the way to emission estimates. And how does this work? And why we're interested in this? We want to identify potential gaps in our understanding of methane emission sources, including potentially missing sources. Inverse modeling generally takes concentration measurements at tower sites, and there are 17 across the state in a statewide network and adjoining networks run by NASA and NIST. And they combine them with transport models and statistical methodologies to derive the likely estimates of emissions by region or sector. These type of studies use a gridded inventory approach as input. These gridded inventories are always unofficial and they're not endorsed by CARB. And different types of assumptions are needed to go into this approach to disaggregate from a total emissions inventory into these regional maps of inventories. And so I just want to emphasize here that getting from these atmospheric measurements at the towers to emission estimates involves many assumptions and accompanying uncertainties. And that's something that we want to keep in mind as we go along. What type of results can we achieve with these types of studies? Using atmospheric measurements as the base data, CARB estimated that the annual statewide methane emissions were about 14 to 47% higher than estimates in CARB's 2014 methane inventory. And that's a statewide estimate of total emissions. And so the questions that follow are, what are some of the possible explanations for these higher emission estimates that we base on atmospheric measurements? It could, be that we have unknown or missing sources. We could deal with emission rate variability and also the estimation methodology limitations. And going on to the same type of study on a regional basis, there's regional variability exists in these types of estimates. Studies have been conducted for the South Coast Air Basin, and there are various number of atmospheric inverse model studies resulted in lower emission estimates than the inventory-based approaches. Overall, the total emissions were within 20% when comparing both approaches, and we also had additional studies at Mount Wilson, and we're able to use source apportionment, and this supported in general the results that were found by the other studies. In another region, at this time the Bay Area, similar atmospheric measurement-based estimates of landfill and wastewater treatment plant methane emissions were twice as high than the used inventory-based estimate. And the total emissions estimate from these atmospheric measurement approaches was about 30 to 130% higher than the inventory-based estimate. You can see here that we have a lot of variability from region to region. And so as a caveat here, studying just one region is not enough. We're interested in the statewide emissions estimates, and therefore we really need to focus on studies that will have a integrative approach across the whole state. And it also is the caveat that a single study cannot be interpolated to achieve statewide significance in this regard. In summary, about the inverse modeling in tall towers methane emissions, inverse modeling can produce spatial maps of regional, statewide, or sectorial methane emissions estimate, but it's only as good as the model and its inputs. It really relies on the statewide inventory that then has to be disaggregated using additional assumptions. And because of all this, studies have uncertainties due to the underlying measurements uncertainties, the uncertainties in the inventories, and also the uncertainties in the gridding processes and disaggregating these inventories into spatial maps. The models themselves add uncertainties in moving from concentrations to emissions. And so overall, based on atmospheric concentration measurements at a limited number of sites, we can achieve statewide results. It's still a pretty sparse network, but we're covering all areas with major anthropogenic emission sources. If we can conduct source apportionment, if it's possible, it can produce and provide some additional insights on sources. However, this approach is not always possible and relies on measurements of other pollutants, such as VOCs, and this adds uncertainties. These type of studies generally do not provide landfill-specific information. It's always a spatial approximation, so we can't extract information on a single landfill or a group of landfill from this type of study. Overall, atmospheric-based estimates can provide a high-level statewide emission estimate. We can use them to evaluate GHG emission trends over time as we implement regulations, and they can inform additional research directions. Satellites might improve abilities in the future as they can provide new and improved spatial data sets. Moving on to an airborne method that has been widely applied throughout the state, the so-called airborne mass balance approach. The general idea is that we measure methane leaving the box and methane entering the box, and the difference between the two will be an emission rate from an observed facility within the box. And on the left-hand side, you can see a cylinder flown by an aircraft with the wind blowing in from one direction and blowing the methane that's emitted at the bottom of the cylinder out. And the aircraft will measure incoming and outgoing methane and thus arrive at a mass balance flux and emission rate for this facility. And in practice, you can see on the right-hand side, we have an implementation and the flight path of an actual aircraft with methane enhancement leaving the volume on one side. So what are the results of this type of approach when it comes to landfills? As a highlight, we measured about 53 landfills representing the majority of waste in place in California. We measured them in multiple regions, and we included open and closed landfills. Overall landfill emissions from this type of approach averaged about 1,000 kilograms per hour with an uncertainty of about 700 kilograms per hour of methane. Closed landfills measured, the emissions measured over closed landfills were low, even for those with large amounts of waste in place. And the public report is available for this type of study. In summary, for the airborne mass balance, it's a snapshot in time. Each measurement is 1 hour. As a benefit, we can measure an entire facility emissions every hour directly at the time of overflight. This method has been verified and validated with controlled release experiments. There's no need for ground-based access, but we do need an available aircraft, clear airspace, and we can only fly in certain conditions when weather and atmospheric conditions allow. We need spatially separated facilities. If we have a large number of facilities in close vicinity, we cannot measure emissions from a single facility, but we'll only get the grouping. Measurements are still relatively expensive because they involve an aircraft and pilots. And we cannot determine where in a facility measurements will come from. Moving on to another method called the eddy covariance tower. And just in a quick explanation of how does this work, it's an approach that measures turbulence transport in the atmosphere. In the boundary layer, the first few hundred meters of the atmosphere, most transport is turbulent, and this measurement will provide a continuous area source emission estimate from landfills or other surfaces that we instrument. We use gas analyzers for methane, CO2, and water vapor in combination with the wind sensor. And this type of approach just uses a tripod with solar panels and can be quickly deployed for extended periods of time. An eddy covariance tower measures an upwind area from the tower. You can see in the middle here 2 pictures of this instrumentation on a landfill looking over the footprint, the upwind direction. And you can see here the cover type is intermediate cover with some vegetation that's green or dried out depending on the season. A footprint diagram is shown on the left-hand side. The red dot is the tower. The footprint will extend upwind. It will depend on wind direction. So the tower can only measure upwind areas at the time. As wind changes, the footprint will change. And it can measure a certain distance upwind depending on wind speed, roughness of the surface, and atmospheric turbulence. As we move on, we have, as one of our main objectives was to conduct a comprehensive long-term study on one of the landfills in the Sacramento area and to observe methane emissions throughout the season and throughout the years. On the right-hand side, you can see a diagram. The waste placement area is outlined in blue. We have a long-term observation eddy covariance tower with the red dot here and a secondary tower with the blue dot. The black circles indicate the maximum footprint during daytime conditions, and the white circle extends out further as nighttime conditions typically lead to larger footprints. But you can see that an eddy covariance tower will measure several acres of the landfill, but it will not cover a complete landfill. And even with a couple towers in this case, we can only measure part of this landfill. And the different modules here are indicated. We have different operational practices. This is a closed part on the EC1 sector, and the EC2 was located closer to an active phase and was able to measure some of these operational differences. We also deployed other methods alongside. So we had emission estimates using a variety of other tools, such as airborne and mobile measurements, and we're able to compare some of these. We were able to observe climatic and operational impacts, different cover types, and different operational practices, active versus closed parts of the landfill, in regards to methane emissions. And in the next step, we expanded to a different type of landfill with a different cover type, in this case, a membrane. Overall, the results show a high degree of variability and seasonality. The observed methane emissions were highest at the specific landfill measured during the summer and wet winter months. Periods of heavy rainfall, high temperatures, and falling pressure led to the highest observed methane emissions. Active landfill zones also contributed to high emissions. Total emissions from small active zones could be equal to the rest of the landfill, as observed with these two towers. In summary, for a specific landfill, this is a self-contained autonomous measurement. It's continuous 24/7 year-round, and the measurements contain all sources within a footprint. But the footprint is only several acres and only measures upwind of the tower at any given half hour. This method requires flat sites and is difficult to scale up to an entire facility. And it's even more difficult to measure more than one facility, as it would require a multitude of towers. Overall, we can say that this method helps us understand the variability of emissions and the underlying causes, such as climate or operations at a specific landfill, but it's difficult to scale up. As we move on to our next method, we see here a car that's been instrumented with the methane analyzer and the wind measuring device, and this is what we call a mobile monitoring solution for individual landfills. With this type of approach, we can estimate total facility emissions from landfills using a vehicle with a roof rack. Again, we have a methane analyzer and a wind sensor that comprise the instrument package, and they're the same type of instrument that you saw in the eddy covariance slides just a second ago. How does it work? We have an emission source that emits a plume of methane, and we drive the car back and forth on a public road downwind from this emission source, with each pass we will capture a plume that will move around a bit depending on wind direction and geometry, and you know, like it's not a steady process. So we'll generally conduct 5 to 10 passes downwind. We then use this data to come up with an average plume and use a Gaussian plume model and inversion statistics to come up with the emission rate. So this is an example here at the landfill in the Sacramento area. We measured about 6 kilometers downwind to the northeast. The red trace here is the plume as measured along a public highway. We then can do this, repeat this 10 times and come to a facility level emission estimate. We can also take this type of measurement onto a site, and this is a trace on a road on a landfill, and observe high concentration plumes from local sources like hotspots or leaks that occur along landfill wells, for example. And just to indicate here, this red circle shows the eddy covariance tower, and we were able to correlate some of the measurements from the eddy covariance tower with the mobile observations. As we go on, our general objective using the mobile platform along the landfill is we wanted to follow the seasonal variation of landfill emissions at the facility where we had several flex towers. And then we also were hoping to compare the relationship between the mobile measurements and some of the mass balance flights and see how they correlate and what the agreement is when we look at overall landfill emissions for this facility. Here are some results. On the left-hand box, you can see the one-to-one plot between the airborne emission rates on the x-axis and the mobile emission rates on the y-axis. And the agreement is good. We get 4 measurements here that agree pretty well with good statistics. We can also see on the right-hand side, we have the time trace for the mobile and the airborne measurements below. This is about 2.5 years, 6 airborne measurements and about 14 mobile measurements. You can see that the mobile measurements resolve more variability, but also the involved error is the uncertainty is larger. But it allows us for more frequent sampling. And of course, the mobile measurements were curtailed at the onset of the pandemic in 2020. Overall, we can say, in summary, that mobile measurements allow us to conduct snapshot measurements, snapshots in time of total facility emissions under the right conditions. The mobile platform can be deployed relatively quickly. It doesn't require facility access, but it does require road access immediately downwind from the facility. If the wind shifts and there's no roads in the other sector, we won't be able to conduct a measurement. It's relatively time intensive. A single measurement probably takes a half day, so you can conduct a measurement within a morning or an afternoon session, but you cannot measure 10 landfills in a day with a single platform. There's uncertainties that remain because this is an approximation of the emissions plume. We use average plume traces at the ground level to derive the plume shape and emission rate. This is not a direct measurement like the airborne mass balance method, for example. And the resulting uncertainties show that they just will remain larger than a direct measurement. Overall, this provides a support for other approaches, such as the airborne or the eddy covariance data sets, and then enables us to validate particularly airborne measurements independently. Moving on to the overall summary to wrap it up, I've shown you quite a few different methods, and they're really complementary of each other, but they all are either snapshots in time or lack specificity or have higher uncertainties. Facility measurements really so far have the limitations that they're only snapshots, so we cannot scale them up to annual emission estimates. The flex towers, which are a continuous measurement, provide us seasonalities, but are difficult to scale up. As far as regional studies concerned, they provide insights in which regions or sector emit, but they really lack detail on specific sources. We cannot make inferences on specific landfills. Overall, each method has its own uncertainties, and they all have to be considered as we move forward. In terms of future research, we hope that new technologies may enable us to do continuous emission monitoring of facility level estimates. There are some new technologies that are coming online, and we're hoping to engage with some of them to bridge some of the gaps that we showed in this presentation. And we're also hoping that new types of satellite data will provide higher resolution spatial inputs that are independent from inventories. And so we're hoping that some of these newer studies that will use similar to future satellite really will provide a step forward in that direction. And then in terms of future research, CARB always looks for input, for more research ideas. So we're always happy if people come up with new ideas and approach us, and we're happy to entertain them and hopefully move forward as a whole agency in our understanding of methane emissions. And with this, I will wrap up and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Matthias. A lot of really great work and a lot of good information there. And thanks again. Next, we're going to hear about a study more specific to landfills by Anthi Alexiadis. Anthi?
Hi, thanks, Jorn. Hi, everyone. My name is Anthi Alexiadis, and I'm going to present a brief overview of a landfill gas study that was performed by Jim Hansen and fellow researchers at Cal Poly University and was funded by CowerCycle and CARB. So the full report and a much more thorough presentation that was given by the study authors back in March of 2021 is available there on our website, and you're really going to want to check that out because we're going to barely scratch the surface here today. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this was a really comprehensive field investigation of gas emissions from California landfills. So they selected representative sites and took aerial measurements at 16 landfills and then used static flux chambers at a subset of 5 of those landfills. So when I say it's comprehensive, I mean that in a couple of different ways. One is the number of samples that were collected and other types of measurements that were taken at each landfill, and in terms of the number of gas species that were analyzed. And so that included 4 greenhouse gases and 78 non-methane volatile organic compounds across 11 chemical families. So we're going to focus in on mostly the findings related to methane today, but if you're interested in more of those VOC emission findings, there's a lot of great information in the report. Next slide, please. So once all that data was collected, they did a really extensive data analysis effort. So the authors looked for correlations between measured emissions and a really wide array of parameters to better understand the impacts of these different operational, environmental, and climatic conditions. So, variations between landfills, of course, are always really interesting, but perhaps even more useful in this study were some of the comparisons that were made within a single landfill, right? Because that can kind of allow you to sort of set aside the effects of some of those environmental factors, for example, that are really outside of an operator's control. So for example, taking ground measurements, at the same time at 2 spots on the landfill surface that are similar, except that they have different types of cover, right? That kind of allows you to really isolate the effectiveness of that cover. And then finally, the researchers used their aerial and ground measurements along with gas collection data to estimate collection efficiency and compared those to the modeled results. Next slide, please. Okay, so this table shows the 16 landfills that were selected for the aerial measurements. And then those rows in gray are the subset of 5 sites where ground measurements were also taken. So part of this work included an extensive characterization of all the landfills in the state. So before you even get to any of the results in the report, it provides a really useful compilation of things like surface areas, cover types, the depth of buried waste, and other operational conditions like that. And then there's some really neat maps showing, which climate zone each landfill is located in, its proximity to things like oil and gas infrastructure, fault lines, population centers, et cetera. So here you can see that the selected sites cover a really wide range of landfill sizes and operational characteristics, and they reflect the distribution of climate zones where the state's waste is disposed. And I didn't show this on the slide, but I also wanted to mention that the selected landfills ranged between 30 and 70 years old, and none of them were closed yet, right? They're all actively accepting waste at the time the study was done. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so just a quick look at some of the methods that were employed. So of course, as with many of these studies, we want to keep some limitations in mind, right? There were a large number of ground measurements that were taken in this field campaign, and they were all done in duplicate. But the flux chambers were only in place for 1 or 2 hours, when samples were taken, and just in a few spots across the landfill surface, like I'm showing in this map example here on the left. So that can be really valuable for, detecting what gas species are present and looking for certain trends. But to extrapolate those emissions into whole site, those measurements into whole site emissions, you'd really have to assume that the measurement on just that 1 square meter is representative of a much larger area. And then similarly, as my colleagues have mentioned, and I think we'll talk more about today, we know that emission rates can be highly variable over time. So they did try to take the aerial and ground measurements at the same time when possible, like I'm showing there on the photo on the right. But of course, you're only providing a snapshot in time. So we know there's going to be a lot of uncertainty anytime we're taking measurements on just a few days and trying to use that to inform an estimate of annual emissions, right? Okay, next slide, please. Great, so now we'll dive into some of the results and conclusions of the study. So this table shows the correlation coefficients between operational parameters and emissions measured on the ground at those 5 landfills. So what they found is the ground methane measurements were most strongly correlated to cover types. So the correlations were positive for daily and intermediate covers, meaning that there were higher methane emissions where there were large areas of those types of covers. Whereas that highly negative correlation for final covers, that negative 0.9 there at the very bottom of the table, that indicates that there were decreases in methane emissions with increasing final cover area. So this relationship, I'm sorry, my computer's about to die. I need to plug in 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so this relationship between the emissions and covers was the most consistent finding in the study. So we're going to take a closer look at that in an upcoming slide. But I also just wanted to mention here that there are a lot of other variables that are explored in the full report. So here we're just kind of zooming in at this subset of operational parameters. But if you do go, look deeper at the results in the full report, I think you'll come away with the same conclusion that we did, that, landfills are just really complex ecosystems, and there just isn't any one parameter that can explain all of this variability. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's a similar table looking at those same operational parameters and how they correlated to the aerial methane measurements. So you can see these were mainly sensitive to landfill size characteristics. So all those strong positive correlations just indicate that the emissions are expected to increase with the scale of landfill operations. So not too surprising there. Next slide, please. Great, so as I mentioned, the analysis showed that cover type was the most significant operational factor that affected the surface fluxes. So the study took a really close look at different cover materials and ultimately characterized and tested 31 distinct cover types. So that included, digging down to measure the thickness of each layer, taking core samples back to the lab to measure the composition, and a bunch of properties like porosity and particle size and solubility, et cetera. So as we look at this data across all 5 landfills, we can see that while there's significant variability between landfills, which is shown in the, kind of the width of those gray bars, you can see also that the average flux, which is shown in that black line across each bar, is several orders of magnitude lower in areas with final cover. And in fact, at 3 out of the 4 landfills that had final cover in place, that flux is negative with final cover, meaning that the gas was being drawn into the landfill rather than being emitted out to the atmosphere at the time these measurements were taken. So in general here, they found that soil covers were much more effective than non-soil covers, and those coarse, highly porous materials like auto fluff and construction and demolition waste that are used in daily covers were the least effective materials. And then among the intermediate covers, they concluded that soil only was better than soil that's layered or mixed up with green waste. And finally, the conventional clay covers are more effective than alternative final covers. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are some of the conclusions or recommendations that emerged from this part of the study. So for one, we really want to limit the area of active waste placement that's sometimes referred to as the working face. And then we also want to avoid having concentrated areas of wet waste, or install some really robust cover over those wet waste placement zones, because they found that those can lead to particularly high N2O emissions. And then next, because the daily covers had the highest flux, we really want to try to minimize how long we rely on it by installing the intermediate cover within days rather than weeks of waste placement. And for intermediate covers, they really found that, the thicker the better, and that also goes for final covers. And the researchers developed these, nice handy recommended thresholds for the final covers. Next slide, please. Okay, so next let's talk about the collection efficiency estimates. So collection efficiency is the methane that's collected, which is continuously measured and reported by the operator. So that numerator in both of these equations at the top of the slide is kind of a known quantity, right, with pretty low uncertainty. And then that is divided by the total methane generated, which is predicted using EPA's LandGEM model for the modeled results that are shown in dark blue. And then for the measured collection efficiency, the generation is the amount that's collected plus the aerial or ground measurements, which are extrapolated to estimate annual emissions. So this is where those limitations that I mentioned earlier really come into play, because estimating collection efficiency required scaling up and extrapolating those measured emission rates to an annual basis in order to compare that with the total methane that was captured over the year by the landfill's gas collection system. So you can see, at a glance here that the approaches don't always line up. Sometimes the modeled result is higher, sometimes it's lower. And overall, the different approaches to estimating collection efficiency led to a range between 25 and 100% across all of the landfills, although you can also see the majority of estimates fell between 60 and 90%. So from this part of the study, the researchers really stressed that improved modeling of methane generation, how much is a ton of waste going to decompose in each year at a given landfill, that's a really critical piece to be able to more accurately assess fugitive emissions going forward. And then they also cautioned that, our conventional approaches based on, limited factors alone, like waste in place and age and waste composition, might not be reliable. And then finally, they said that collection efficiency is so highly variable that the quantity of captured gas alone is also not going to be a reliable measure of fugitive emissions. Okay, next slide, please. Last slide here. All right, so I wanted to quickly, summarize some of the VOC results. It's a big part of the report, so I didn't want to completely ignore that here in this workshop that's focused on methane emissions. So one of the interesting things that this study did was to compare the concentrations in raw landfill gas that was, from the landfill's collection system to the concentrations in samples taken from ground chambers. So the collected gas, which is shown in the figure on the left, they said that best represents the gas that's in the waste mass prior to any transformation processes that are occurring in the cover materials. And so what they found is, they didn't really see similar trends when comparing these two sources. And so they concluded that the collected gas samples might not be a reliable indicator of the emissions that could be occurring from the landfill's surface. And then they also suggested that certain gas species might be being generated within the cover materials. So you can see in the figure on the left, there were no organic alkyl nitrates, or ON, detected in any of those landfill gas samples, but it was present at the surface at each landfill. And then finally, the authors also cautioned that the emissions of one given chemical shouldn't really be used as a surrogate for other chemicals or chemical families, such as we know that methane is often used as a surrogate for non-methane VOCs. We can go to the last slide, and that's it for me. And thank you very much. And I will turn it back over to Matthias or Jorn. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthi. Great study. A lot of really good detail about specifics at individual landfills there. We are getting a lot of good questions in the Q&A. Keep those coming. Thank you. And at this point, we'll turn it over to Cal Recycle and Wes Minderman, who's going to make some comments. Wes.
Hey, thank you, Jordan. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Wes Minderman. I'm the chief of the engineering support branch here at Cal Recycle. And we're, as mentioned throughout, the situations with landfills in California is very, very complex. We have about 140 operating facilities. They vary in size from very small to what we call the mega landfills. The larger facilities being in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area region, San Joaquin Valley, and South Coast here in California. But really, I thought I would spend a moment or two kind of explain how Cal Recycle supports these efforts to try and understand these landfill emissions here in California. First of all, our authority here is with respect to subsurface migration of methane, really, primarily, and not emissions to the atmosphere. We regulate diversion requirements here in California, such as the diversion requirements from the AB 939 in the 1990s to promote recycling and reuse, and also the more recent diversion requirements for organic matter required as part of SB 1383. We also, through our local enforcement agency partners, and there's about 60 of them here in California, most of them are based on county health departments. We regulate the day-to-day operations of those landfills with respect to solid waste facility permit requirements. That regulation includes landfill gas migration, as I mentioned earlier, or subsurface landfill gas migration, daily and intermediate cover requirements, daily maximum tonnages per the permit that are accepted at the landfill. So with respect to the day-to-day operations and really what's going on at each of the individual facilities throughout California, those are really our boots on the ground in terms of landfill disposal operations here in the state. That being said, California has and remains interested in supporting the efforts to better understand the performance of facilities with respect to emissions at landfills, with information that we collect as part of Cal Recycle's responsibilities. That information varies. It varies in the terms of the frequency that it's collected, how it's reviewed, and how it's made available to our sister agencies such as CARB for use in their work, or also to the public. One we mentioned earlier about landfill gas modeling. One of the key questions in there is, what is the composition of the waste going into each specific landfill? Cal Recycle does, as a matter of principle, or as a matter of requirement, do waste composition studies every 5 years. So the last study, we have information available as late as 2021 that might be useful in landfill gas modeling, landfill gas generation modeling, and our next disposal-based study is going to be conducted in 2024, and we expect that information to be published right around July 1 of 2025. We also, as part of our ongoing responsibility for helping enforce the closure and post-closure maintenance requirements for operating landfills, have information on facility capacity. And that's sort of a backdoor to information in terms of waste in place and where that waste is and how it's situated at the facility. It's not collated by Cal Recycle, but we do have it on a facility-specific basis on our solid waste information system. And if we have to support efforts, we have put staff resources into trying to collate and collect and maintain that information when necessary. There's been a lot of interest lately in terms of the organic disposal reduction and the impact on sites throughout California. We do have a site status impact report that's due from each operating facility that accepts organic waste. Those reports will be due no later than January 1st, 2023, so they're upcoming. And really, this was, a report that was requested from the operators to understand what the impacts of the diversion of organics is going to have on each specific facility. Part of the information that we anticipate will be presented will be, the volume of organic waste typically disposed at the landfill prior to the implementation of the disposal reduction requirements. And then what is the organic waste that is currently being disposed at the landfill. We've also asked them to indicate the actual or anticipated reductions in organic waste volumes resulting as implementation of the organics disposal reduction requirements. Other information we anticipate we're going to collect is going to be on the usage of daily, intermediate, and final cover. You heard significant discussion as part of the previous discussion on the study that cover type and placement and time and place may significantly impact landfill gas emissions. So we'll be collecting some of that information through these reports. We're also asking them to describe any changes in their landfill gas control or monitoring systems due to the potential reduction in landfill gas. So that being said, I don't want to overestimate the applicability of these requirements or the applicability of these reports to the subject that we're discussing today. These plans, were originally devised as sort of a permitting tool for facilities to take a look at their operation and see how the organics reduction was going to affect their operations and if their permits were going to be affected. Although there is a lot of technical information in there, we're waiting to see how useful that information might be in terms of the questions we're trying to answer today regarding landfill gas emissions. We've received a handful of reports so far. Each final report will be available in our solid waste information system. And again, as I mentioned, the value of this information and whether it will be useful to collect and collate to help answer these questions regarding landfill gas emissions remains to be seen, and hopefully will become clearer in the spring of 2023. So again, CalRecycle is happy to support these efforts with respect to the information that it collects as part of its regulatory authority. We've been happy to do it in the past, and we remain to be happy to do it in the future. And with that, Jorn, I think that concludes my presentation, and I'll be happy to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Wes. Appreciate it. Excellent information. All right, so we've been at it for about an hour. The next presentation coming up is going to talk about a program of identifying individual plumes at landfills and mitigating them. But we're going to take a short break so everyone can get up, stretch your legs, go grab some water or whatever you need to refill your coffees, and let's come back at 12:10. Thanks, everyone. All right, and we're back. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you're able to stretch your legs and get some coffee or something like that. Thank you so much to the first speakers, Matthias, Antti, and Wes. We're now going to switch gears a little bit and talk more about ambient measurements for enabling mitigation. And Dr. Jason Schroeder is going to walk us through that. Jason, take it away. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you for the introduction, Jorn. I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Okay, should be able to see everything now. Sorry, having a little bit of difficulty here. I apologize. All right, let me try again here. Get a fresh start on the screen share. There we go. Okay. Okay, so thanks again, Jorn, for the introduction. So as Jorn said, I am Dr. Jason Schroeder, and I will be sharing some results from research that CARB has done using a technology known as methane remote sensing. In particular, this technology has shown great promise as a tool for directly supporting leak identification and mitigation. Part of our role in CARB's research division is to keep abreast and up to date on new technologies that may be beneficial to California. In the mid-2010s, intriguing advancements in methane detecting technology began to catch our eye. Scientists, primarily from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, had started publishing papers demonstrating the use of a technique called hyperspectral remote sensing to detect individual methane plumes. This technology captures precise measurements of sunlight reflected off of Earth's surface, and when those data are carefully analyzed, you can pick out methane signals. One of the biggest benefits of this type of measurement, which is known as remote sensing, is that you can collect measurements from a long distance away. In this case, the instrument was flown on an aircraft, which allows the instrument to cover large areas in a relatively short amount of time. On the right is an example of raw methane data from an overflight of an oil field in Kern County. Now, with further image processing, these images can be cleaned up a little bit. And now in this example, which was taken at a later date, also during an overflight of an oil field in Kern County, you can clearly see a well-defined plume of methane. And upon closer inspection, you can determine that the plume originates from an individual storage tank. This ability to attribute these methane plumes to individual sources is because of the fine spatial resolution of the sensor. In this image, each pixel is less than 3 meters by 3 meters in size. These data can also be processed relatively quickly by computer algorithms, and plume images like these become available generally within a few hours of overflight. Now, before we go any further, we should mention some of the limitations of this technology. In the image on the previous slide, we saw a really well-defined methane plume, and that is precisely what this technology is best suiting for, finding what we call large localized sources of methane rather than total methane emissions. So let's consider this scene at a landfill with a normally functioning cover and gas collection system. So even at systems like this, with covers and gas collection systems in place, there would still be small amounts of methane that diffuse through the surface. This corroborates what we saw in presentations by Matthias and Antti. And so when you sum up all of these small diffuse sources over the whole landfill, these are what we would call a diffuse or area-wide sources. At a landfill such as this, overflights with this remote sensing technology would not detect any methane plumes, as the emissions coming from any one point on the landfill are below the limit of detection for the instrument and are too small to be seen. So in this scenario, the total emissions coming from this landfill would be equal to the sum of all of those diffuse or area-wide emissions over the entire landfill surface. And none of these emissions would be detectable with methane remote sensing technology. In contrast, we can imagine that this same landfill exists with the same area-wide emissions, but now let's say that there's some kind of event or some issue that's causing large emissions to come out of one small point in the landfill. This is what we would call a large localized source of emissions, and in this example, that's indicated by the big gold arrow. In this scenario, an overflight of this landfill would yield exactly one plume detection at the large localized source of emissions. Here's an example of what a plume detection at a landfill might look like. So here, the colors represent methane concentrations from low in purple up to high in red. In this example, we can easily pinpoint a likely location for a large localized source of methane on this landfill, especially when you consider that on this day, the wind was coming from the southwest. You can also note that this technology only sees methane in some places, and you cannot see methane over the whole landfill, particularly places upwind of the methane plume and off to the sides of the methane of the landfill. And again, the reason for that is because methane concentrations over the rest of the landfill are too low to be detected, but we know that they're there, and we know that methane is being emitted in small amounts over the rest of the landfill surface as well. So going back to our hypothetical example, in this case, the total emissions from this landfill are a combination of the sum of all of the diffuse area-wide sources, similar to before, but now also includes the sum of all of the emissions from large localized sources. And these plume mapping remote sensors would only be able to detect the large localized sources. So we know that this is not a technique for measuring the total emissions coming off of this landfill. I'm going to use the next few slides to really try to emphasize this concept. So let's imagine that we were able to somehow continuously measure the total emissions coming from our hypothetical landfill for one entire year, and that we were able to generate a time series of those total emissions, shown here as a blue line with time on the x-axis and the instantaneous methane emissions rate in kilograms per hour shown as a blue line here. Now, let's say we fly over our hypothetical landfill with a methane plume mapper 3 times in 1 year, and each time we overfly it, we detect a methane plume. The emissions estimated from each flyover are shown as gold stars. And now by looking at the y-axis, we can see that the gold stars are always lower than the blue line at the same point in time, meaning that for any given time, the emissions detected by plume mapping flyovers are always less than the total emissions coming off of the landfill. Sometimes these gold stars can be quite close to the blue line, meaning that a very large fraction of the landfill's total emissions come in the form of these large localized emissions. But in other cases, the gold star could be quite far from the blue line, meaning that the emissions detected by this plume mapping technology make up a smaller fraction of the landfill's total emissions. Now, things get even more challenging when we start trying to relate these measurements to total annual emissions. Because the blue line, which again represents total emissions, is continuous over the whole year, we can simply take its average to get the landfill's total annual average emissions. In this example, if we take the average of the 3 gold stars, we get a lower number as expected. But because these measurements are not continuous over the whole year, you can often run into issues of statistical representativeness. So to visualize that, let's imagine that instead of 3 flyovers, we had only performed 2. So now we're losing 1 star. And in this case, the average of the 2 remaining gold stars moves up. And as a result, it's now actually quite close to the blue line. You can imagine all kinds of other permutations here with adding or removing gold stars and thinking about how that might affect the location of this gold or yellow line that you calculate. And so the point I'd like to emphasize is that the fewer measurements you have, the less confidence you can have in extrapolating those measurements over time. And because these plume mappers are generally flown on aircraft, we cannot collect measurements all of the time. In fact, measurements tend to be somewhat infrequent, meaning it may not be as defensible to use these plume mapping data alone to try to estimate total emissions coming from landfills. In reality, it's even more complex than in this example, because in reality, we do not have any systems in place to continuously measure the total emissions coming from landfills. I think Matthias and Antti both emphasized that in their presentations. So when we go out and do these flyovers of landfills with the methane plume mappers, we have no context about how representative these measurements are of the landfill's total emissions. So to summarize, the methane plume mapping technology cannot be reliably used to inform us about landfill emission inventories. Nevertheless, there are many ways that we can that these data can still be useful for mitigating methane emissions from landfills, as we will see in the remainder of this presentation. But just before we jumped into that result, I really wanted to make sure that we all start off on the same foundation and same understanding of what this technology can and cannot do. So with that in mind, let's move on to discuss some of the methane plume mapping work that CARB has supported. CARB has funded or supported 3 separate airborne campaigns in California aimed at demonstrating the potential of methane remote sensing technology. The first campaign, called the California Methane Survey, was conducted from 2016 to 2018 and was designed to survey broad portions of the state. A map of California with all of the surveyed areas is shown to the right. We overflew more than 270,000 facilities and potential methane emission components. Each of them were actually overflown multiple times. Plumes were found in each and every sector for methane emissions in California. And during these flights, 436 waste disposal sites in California were overflown, And of these 436, methane plumes were detected at 30 landfills and 2 composting facilities. I wanted to use this slide to show an example of what some of these plumes looked like during the California methane survey. So again, there's a map of California with all the survey areas. The red dots indicate plumes that were detected. Example A represents plumes detected at a compressor station at a natural gas facility. Example B represents a plume detected at an oil well. Example C represents an example of a plume detected at an LNG tank. Example D is methane detected at a dairy. Example E is a methane plume detected at a wastewater treatment plant. And then example F down at the bottom here is an example of plumes detected at a landfill. So there's a full report with all of the findings that's available on the California Energy Commission website. The exact link to that is provided below. And some of the high-level results and key takeaways surrounding landfills are going to be shown here. So the first key result was that, like I mentioned before, methane plumes were detected at 32 out of the 436 waste disposal sites that were sampled. And so the key takeaway here is that the majority of waste disposal sites in California likely emit as area-wide sources only and are not detectable with this technology. The second key result was that landfill emission rates were pretty variable. They ranged from anywhere from 400 kilograms an hour on the low end all the way up to 3,000 kilograms per hour at the high end, with an average of about 818 kilograms per hour. There's going to be more information on this in the next slide. But the key takeaway here from this point is that when landfills have detectable plumes, they are, on average, quite large. And the third key result was that for landfills with methane plume detections, the detectable emissions were highly persistent, meaning they tended to be there a lot, but the emission rates and spatial patterns of those emissions were highly variable. There'll be some more examples demonstrating what this means in the coming slides, but the key takeaway here is that landfills that have detectable emissions once will tend to have detectable emissions again, but their really high variability means that these emissions that we measure at any one given point in time are not representative of average or long-term conditions over a whole year. And that gets back into that word snapshotty that we've been using throughout this workshop. So going back to that second key point about landfill emissions being variable and quite large, I wanted to show what that means. This graph really gives a demonstration of that second key result, that landfill emissions tend to be, on average, quite large. This is a graph of the distribution of emission rates for detected methane plumes broken up by sector. So if you look at the gray line, which represents estimated emissions from the oil and gas sector as detected by these methane plume mapping sensors, we see that the majority of detected emissions were between 10 and 100 kilograms an hour, with very few plumes having rates below 10 kilograms an hour and very few plumes having rates above 100 kilograms an hour. Most of the other sectors show similar behavior to oil and gas. Landfills, which are shown as the blue line on this graph, are the exception. And the majority of this distribution lies above 100 kilograms an hour, and actually much of it lies above 1,000 kilograms per hour. So clearly landfill plumes tend to be larger than plumes that we saw in other sectors. And then this slide and the next slide are going to highlight some of the variability that we observed in plumes within a single landfill. So this slide shows overflights of the same landfill over 3 years, with 2016 on the left and 2018 on the right. Here we can clearly see that the spatial pattern of plumes is not consistent from year to year. Plumes were always present when we overflew this landfill, but the locations of the plumes were not always the same. The magnitude of emissions estimated from these plume images also changes, with 2016 having the highest estimated rate of emissions. This result is not necessarily unique. We saw similar behavior at other landfills, which again really serves to highlight that these plume measurements, which tend to be snapshotty and taken and represent measurements at a single point in time, are not necessarily suitable for estimating annual average emissions. This slide shows an even more extreme example of this same phenomenon. This landfill was flown over 2 times on the same day, a little over 2 hours apart. In the first overflight on the left, which was conducted at around 10:30 a.m. on October 23rd, plume activity was noted in the northern part of the landfill. The second time this landfill was overflown, again about 2 hours later, a little over 2 hours later, plume activity was still noted in the northern part of the landfill, but an additional plume was detected in the southern part of the landfill, which was not there previously. So because of this, the estimated emission rate, the total estimated emission rate for this landfill based just on these plume images, is quite different between the 2 overflights. And so this sort of extreme variability is really difficult to predict, and we have no idea how long this sort of phenomenon may persist for. So I really hope that this example and the example on the previous slide have given a really good visualization of what we mean when we say that these measurements are too snapshotty to be used for annual accounting purposes. Nevertheless, we've done additional research studies in California with these data, or with this type of sensor. So moving beyond the California Methane Survey, 2 additional campaigns conducted in 2020 and 2021 were designed to help take the next step and test how effective these data could be in supporting methane mitigation, rather than just studying emissions. In 2020, CARB worked with industry to enroll voluntary participants. We overflew their assets, and when we found plumes, we shared the images with them and requested that they do on-the-ground survey to look for the source of the plume. In 2021, we let industry know that we were flying, but we shared plume images and requested follow-up regardless of whether or not they had been previously enrolled. We also worked to improve our internal processes by automating our workflows and improving our collaboration between research and non-research CARB staff, as well as our collaborations with industry. Here are some of the high-level findings from these mitigation research studies. In total, 76 plumes were detected across these 2 campaigns, and you can see how many operators these plumes belong to for each year. The end result was that these plume images resulted in 45 incidence reports being shared between CARB and landfill operators. An incidence report is going to be expanded upon in the next couple of slides as to what that means. So I think the best way to show the potential of these data is to show a couple of examples of incidence reports from these airborne research flights. In this example, we overflew landfills in Southern California on November 11th of 2021. During this flight, a methane plume was observed at a landfill as shown here. And you can see the plume detection is noted on this calendar up here in the top right. CARB staff worked to determine the owner of this landfill, and we shared the plume image along with a voluntary response form with the operator. And so you can see that was done on November 16th as per the calendar in the top right here. As per our request, the operator went on to perform an inspection of their landfill in the vicinity of the plume that we detected. Using a handheld methane sensor, they surveyed the area and found high methane concentrations in the vicinity of the plume, and they determined that the source of the methane was from a set of damaged PVC pipe markers. The operator was able to make repairs and verified the fix with a follow-up on-the-ground inspection. The operator also shared their findings with us, which we store in a database with all of our plume detection information. And from the timeline up here, you can see that the time from the initial plume detection to the time when the operator was able to find the source and make repairs was about a week. So this operator filled out and returned the entire standard feedback form that we had sent to them. Their responses provided critical information that helps us better understand the nature of this particular emission source. We store all of the full operator responses in a database and add in our own high-level classifications to the feedback. The source of emissions in this incidence was generally classified under GCCS, well and pipe issues, and was labeled as stopped or repaired. A second example is provided here. In this incidence, we overflew a landfill on November 10th and detected a methane plume. The operator was notified of this on November 16th. This operator did not fill out the standard response form. However, they did put together an extensive report that they had prepared themselves and shared their findings with us. In this case, the operator went out on foot and surveyed the area of the plume image and found high methane concentrations originating from cracks in the landfill surface. The soil in the area was recompacted, and follow-up surveys showed reduced methane concentrations in the area. Again, we stored the full operator response in our database, and in this case, the source of emissions was generally classified under landfill surface cover cracks. One thing to note in this example is that the operator performed their inspection and did their mitigation duties within a few weeks of our original notification. However, they did not respond to CARB with a report of their activities until months later in March of 2022. So those are just a couple of examples of some of our findings when we engaged with operators in voluntary research studies in 2020 and 2021. And this table provides a really high-level summary of some of our findings from these campaigns. Only 3 operators did not reply at all, meaning that we got a response rate of greater than 90% from landfill operators. And of the 42 incidence responses that we did receive, 22 were classified as incidences that were able to be stopped or repaired. So just about half of all of the responses sent back to us indicated that these plumes helped find emissions that could be stopped or repaired. Of course, this is really, really high-level classifications, and each incidence report holds a lot of much greater detail that cannot be easily summarized in a table such as this. And these really detailed incidence reports are incredibly useful to CARB and help us gain a better understanding of factors and practices that may influence emissions. So, looking towards the future, we are beyond excited to continue using this type of technology to support methane mitigation in California. We know that this type of technology can be a game changer, and for this reason, California is spearheading new ways to collect and use this type of data. California is involved in the Carbon Mapper Consortium, which will be launching 2 satellites equipped with similar technology to what was used on the airplanes in the studies presented here. These 2 satellites were funded by philanthropists, and California will receive data for free. California has also allocated $100 million for additional satellite methane detecting capabilities. This money will be allocated through a fair, open, and competitive bid process. In addition, CARB will continue to support additional research flights, including planned flights for the middle of 2023. I wanted to show a quick video demonstrating how satellite monitoring would generally work. There are multiple companies that are building satellites capable of detecting methane plumes. The video that I'm going to show is produced by Carbon Mapper, which is one of those companies, and is meant to visually demonstrate how these types of satellites will work. Again, while this video is specific to one company, the general concept is similar for some of the other companies as well. So what you're going to see in this video is satellites passing over the Permian Basin, which is an oil and gas producing region in West Texas and New Mexico. And as they fly over, they're going to collect plume measurements. So I'll click play here. And hopefully this plays clearly for you all. And you'll see satellites coming in from the north, heading towards the south. And as they pass over part of the Permian Basin, they collect data, and you can identify individual methane plumes within those that swath of data. Second satellite passed over and more plumes are collected. Now a third satellite comes over, collects more data. Another satellite passes over and collects more data, and so on and so forth. And so you can imagine that with satellites, we can collect measurements over large spatial areas and also with much higher frequency than we could do with airplanes alone. Of course, there are some trade-offs. The satellites will have some lower detection thresholds than we can get with the aircraft because they are at a higher altitude up in space, but the trade-offs are of course very interesting for us. So in summary, we are very excited to see how satellite plume mapping technology evolves in the future, and we will continue our efforts to use these data to support methane mitigation. As we previously acknowledged, these plume mapping data are incredibly useful from a mitigation perspective, but cannot tell us much about total emissions coming from landfills. To this end, we are also looking towards the future of research and designing studies that are tailored for this exact purpose. That is, if we go back to our example, we're looking towards technologies that may help us obtain measurements that can provide the blue line on this graph, which again represents total emissions continuously measured from a landfill. We are planning to conduct pilot studies with potential technologies and determine if such a technology exists that can provide reliable, continuous monitoring of total landfill emissions. We'll use the results of these pilot studies to determine which technologies may be appropriate for scaling up, so we can gain statewide insights. Lastly, we know that continuous measurements of total emissions from landfills are not necessarily useful in a vacuum, and that their further insights could be gained by pairing these data streams with complementary data. That complementary data could include new technologies, new metadata, as well as some of the methods and technologies shown earlier in this workshop by Matthias and Antti. By doing this, we hope to gain a more detailed understanding of landfill methane emissions in California and a better understanding of which conditions and practices tend to be associated with lower or higher emissions. So with that, I'd like to say thanks again for listening to my presentation. Thanks for joining the workshop. We will be moving to a Q&A session, but first I'd like to pass it back to the panel for any closing remarks. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jason. Do any of the other speakers want to say anything at this time before we move to question and answer? All right. Well, thank you to all the speakers. A lot of good information. As you can see, there's a lot going on both in California and worldwide to get our arms around methane and get our arms around methane from landfills. And as we do these studies, we continue to learn more, and I feel like we're getting close to having a really good handle on it, but there's still more work to be done, and look forward to hearing your questions and your input on what we've discussed today. So gonna have Jennifer talk a little bit about how the Q&A session is gonna work. First, Jennifer.
Yep, sorry, I'm here. So I've just turned on the option for people to raise their virtual hand by clicking on the hand at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So we'll try and answer questions verbally. If your hands are raised, I'll be able to call on you and unmute you so that you can speak to us with your question. You can also still continue to send questions in writing in the Q&A, and we do have questions that we've been collecting. We haven't forgotten about those of you who have sent in your questions, so we will try and go through all the written questions and answer those as well. Jordan, do you have a preference? We want to start with the written questions or the people who are raising their hands at this time?
Yeah, maybe we can address the written questions first if we have those teed up.
Okay. Jason, do you want to read those off?
Yeah, sure. So there was an earlier question that asked, what is meant by inventory-based estimate? And this was referring to some of the slides that Matthias had shared about top-down estimates of emissions and specifically inverse modeling. And the way that inverse modeling works is you collect measurements of methane concentrations, and you try to use those measurements of concentrations in conjunction with meteorology to understand where those emissions might have come from. If you try to backtrack, so if you measure methane at one point over here, you try to use meteorology to backtrack where those emissions that you measured might have come from. An important part of inverse modeling is that you also have to use a starting point for where you think emissions might have coming from. For example, if you stand half a mile downwind of a really large power plant and you measure high amounts of, let's say, CO2, you can probably have a good guess that it's coming from that power plant. But if you're just measuring emissions in the middle of measuring methane, for example, in the middle of a field, you might not know what that could have potentially come from. So you have to use some kind of inventory as a starting point to help you guess where those emissions might have come from. And so that's what's meant by that inventory-based estimate. It's a combination of research grade emission inventories, which again are not official and not officially endorsed by CARB, coupled with those measurements and meteorological variables that help us create these or help researchers create these top-down estimates of emissions. All right. A second question that I had noted previously in the Q&A was that the correlation between wet weather and higher emissions could be due to mechanical displacement or increased chemical reactions. Are there any opinions by the panel on how this might play out? Either Antti or Matthias might be the best person to answer this. Are either of you available to answer this question about the correlation between wet weather and higher emissions? Could that be due to mechanical displacement or increased chemical reaction?
I can just take a first shot at that, even though I'm not the expert on this per se, but we probably have some, like when we have flooding conditions, displacement of open air volume in the soil by water. So that's definitely the mechanical displacement. It's probably a decreased chemical reaction as we get rid of the air in the soil column. We probably have more anaerobic conditions and lose ability to oxidize methane. So we will probably have like a double factor here. There might be other things that go on at the same time too. So I haven't gotten any definitive answer on that one, but observation wise, it's probably a combination of several factors.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. I see another question in the Q&A that asks, how does the coefficient for methane translate into measured methane as ppmv, or parts per million by volume? So again, when we collect measurements of methane, we're collecting those measurements above the surface of the landfill, or oftentimes downwind of the landfill. And we measure methane concentrations in units of typically parts per million by volume. So how many molecules of methane are there per molecule of air in a given air mass? And that relates to emissions, again, with a high variability depending on meteorology. If it's really windy one day, the concentration that you measure downwind of a landfill might be different than if it's a very light wind on another day. So it's not a direct, it's difficult to do this translation between measured concentrations and coefficients for methane or methane emissions from a landfill based on that alone. You have to couple these measurements with other sources of information, typically meteorology and others as well. Okay, there's a lot of other questions in the Q&A. Would we mind taking some questions from some live questions? If anyone has any, then I can try to organize questions from the Q&A that we can answer next.
Yes, sure, I can help with that. All right. Let's see, I have Yaniv Sherson. I'm going to allow you to ask your question. You can select to unmute.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're there. Thank you.
Great. So it seems that what's very interesting is that all of the methods appear to conclude that actual methane emissions are higher than measured. And that's interesting. So if that's the case, what is CARB's plan to do with that information with respect to the landfill capture assumption, as well as just future policy?
Tackle the first part of that question. So we've presented a lot of different studies and a lot of different technologies for measuring methane emissions. And for each of them, we've tried to point out that there's pros and cons for each one. Some of them are very snapshotty, and there's always the challenge of taking measurements from one point in time and extrapolating those to a whole year. And that's something that's very challenging to do. Some of the other ones measure emissions continuously, but don't measure emissions over the entire landfill, like the eddy covariance towers that Matthias had shown. And so I think the take-home message really should be that there are a lot of tools at our disposal, and further research needs to be done to fully assess the state of our landfill emissions inventory, and if it truly is higher than expected or something else. It looks like Matt was also on to perhaps answer the second part of the question.
Yeah. Hey, Yaniv. Thanks for the question. I think you probably saw too that Matthias responded in the chat window too, just in terms of the slides that he presented reflecting total methane emissions, not just landfills. So it's an important clarification. And I also just wanted to flag that, and I think you know this, as far as how we approach the collection efficiency values right now within the policy programs like the low carbon fuel standard, we use the collection efficiency values that are in line with what we've done in the inventory historically. And what we're trying to do today is really get out the data on all of the studies and the work that we've done thus far to assess this question of landfill methane emissions. And as Jason mentioned, the various different techniques that we have at our disposal. And I think what you can see is that there's no simple, straightforward kind of answer to how could we adjust that collection efficiency value based on all of the variability of the data and the methods that we have at our disposal. So I really, I kind of want to close by just encouraging you to continue to engage on kind of this workshop and also the LCFS forums on ideas on how we take some of these methods and some of the data, and then also the data that will be coming forward from future measurement techniques, and consider what we could do within kind of the policy programs as well on the collection efficiency values. So thanks.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, take the next question from Adan Prabhu. I'm going to give you option to unmute yourself if you'd still like to ask a question.
Yes, hello everyone. I have seen a lot of measurement information as a means to stop leaks. What about using the methane? It's a precious fuel. We have been able to run a gas turbine with 1.5%, 15,000 ppm methane. We can also destroy methane at 2,000 ppm. And who should we talk to, and how should we address that? We'd like to consider methane not as the enemy, but also as a friend.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So that's a great point, that methane can be useful in some instances if used correctly at landfills. And again, the measurements that we are collecting here are emissions that were released from above the landfill surface cover. So this is methane that was not captured and was not being used. If someone from ISD would like to jump in about landfill uses or uses of landfill gas at landfills, that would be potentially helpful to be done here.
Sure, I can speak to that a little bit. So I think right now, only about a third of the landfills in the state that have collection and control systems are putting that gas to beneficial use for electricity generation. And there are some barriers to, cleaning that gas up and meeting pipeline injection standards. But you're absolutely right. For that portion of gas that is able to be collected, there are significant additional opportunities to get that into beneficial uses, particularly in the more hard to decarbonize sectors of the economy. So we definitely speak to that in the CARB scoping plan that was published recently. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll call on one more hand raised now, and then maybe we'll switch back to a few of the written questions in a minute.
Sounds good, Jennifer.
So I have Roman Vogelsong. I'm going to give you permission to unmute yourself if you still have a question to ask.
Somehow this is Chuck Helgett with Republic Services, and I'm not sure why I came up with Roman other than he may have sent me the invitation. And are you hearing me okay?
Yes, you're there. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I would say an excellent workshop, very informative, a lot of very good data here to absorb. And also note that Republic Services has worked closely with the JPL and CARB on the aerial survey data and have found it to be a very effective mitigation tool. But in our view, sharing information quickly obviously is the key to quick compliance and mitigation of any plumes that are discovered at our landfills and others. We also agree that the extreme variability that we're seeing does not, at least at this point, support using these aerial flyovers as necessarily a predictive tool of annual emissions. We support staff's conclusions also and Bill's notes on collection efficiency. Let's analyze the data and try to figure out the reliability of this data before doing anything significant in that area. And we're supportive of staff's conclusions. We look forward to working with the staff as you move forward on the regs. And just a quick question back to my original point about sharing data. Are you looking at ways that we can work together more closely with you, getting the data on your flyovers sooner so that we can respond more quickly? And obviously, the other side of that is getting data back to you to supplement your database. Is there a way or a forum that we could explore that would allow us to do that?
Hi, Roman. Yeah, thanks for the comment. As for the flyovers, we know that in 2020 and 2021, we have done all of the correspondence between CARB and operators via email, and that's simply not the optimal way to do this, and we're aware of that, especially once we scale up to having satellites providing this kind of data more continuously. It's going to be something that's not manageable with emails. So we're exploring how we want to handle this in the future. It might be some kind of web page with user authentication where we can post data that's only visible to a specific operator, and the operator can upload their response and the results of their surveys and mitigation work on there as well. And we can facilitate more easy sharing of data in that kind of way. That way we don't have to go through emails and try to track down emails. Does that answer your question, Roman?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thanks. And then Jennifer, maybe we can pivot to taking a few questions from the chat here. So I can read these off. So the first one is, how has implementation of California's organic waste law changed landfill operations? And how much are methane emissions from landfills expected to decline as more industrial composters come online?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I can speak to that a little bit. Wes may want to chime in on the first part of the question about how landfill operations have changed. I know that that new organic waste disposal reduction law did just come into effect this year, so it may be that it's too early to tell, but suffice to say that increasingly we expect that landfills will be accepting and disposing less fewer tons of organic waste each year as they find more alternatives, such as recycling through the use of compost and anaerobic digestion, along with food recovery and waste prevention efforts. But to speak to the other question about how much we project methane emissions from landfills to decline as we increasingly utilize these organic recycling alternatives, we did do some modeling that speaks to that question in support of the scoping plan. And so what I can tell you is that, in the 2030 timeline, presuming that we meet our 75% disposal reduction goal by 2025, as is the target, that is really important to avoid many decades of additional methane emissions from being generated. But, the majority of our annual methane emissions are due to, the past decades of waste disposal that's taken place. And so, the diversion that we're starting to ramp up now, isn't going to get us a really big decline by 2030. So we're going to need both that along with increases in control at existing collection and control systems at landfills. So for the scoping plan, we modeled that both a 10% improvement in the ability to capture or reduce emissions from landfills is going to be needed on top of all of our diversion efforts. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, Anthony, and this is Wes Minderman. So getting with respect to the first part of that question and how the reduction in organics may be affecting operations, that's the question we hope to answer with these site impact reports. We've asked the operators to kind of take a look at their operations and report to us any changes that they're seeing. So it may be too early to get the answers to those questions. I don't have anything from the local enforcement agencies that might inform an answer to that question. But hopefully these site status impact reports are going to give us the initial answers to how operations may be changing as a result of the organics diversion required by SB 1383.
Okay, thanks, Wes. Thanks, Wes and Antti. If there's any follow-up to that question, please feel free to post it in the Q&A. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question in the Q&A, which is, have population increases or other demographic changes been investigated for their impact on 1383's requirement to reduce 75% of organic disposal from the 2014 levels? Will a population change weighting coefficient be available for areas experiencing high levels of population change since 2014?
This is Wes Minderman from CalRecycle. I'll take a shot at answering that question. And I guess I'll start off with being very clear here. The 75% reduction is a statewide goal. In other words, local jurisdictions are not being held to specific numbers of 50% or 75% of organics diversion for their specific jurisdiction. It's overall a statewide goal. Your question on how that goal will be, how the achievement of that goal will be measured with respect to increases in population, I don't know the answer to that, but I do want to be very clear here. It is a statewide goal. Local jurisdictions under SB 1383 are really just required to implement programs, and compliance with SB 1383 is how well they are going to implement those programs. And those programs include, programs for organic waste diversion, using recycled organic products, and edible food recovery, to name a few. So local jurisdictions are going to be evaluated not based on an actual diversion number. They're going to be evaluated on, hey, are you implementing the programs required by SB 1383 and making a good faith effort to achieve the statewide goal? And I hope that answers that question.
Thanks, Wes. And as before, if there are any follow-up questions for that, again, please feel free to post in the Q&A. Next question in the Q&A is from Stephen Rosenblum. Are there processes in place for landfill operators to share information on best practices?
Jason, I'll take that question. As one of the staff who helped to implement the landfill methane regulation, I really want to take that as sort of a recommendation for us to take back and think about. I know that I've learned a lot in my conversations from landfill operators about various challenges that they encounter, and certainly from annual reporting, the various ways that they're able to mitigate the emissions that they find through their quarterly surface emissions monitoring surveys. So I think it would be really great to identify, more ways for landfill operators to sort of come together and collect and disseminate their best practices and findings for mitigation. So thanks for the question, Stephen. And if you have any recommendations along those lines, we're all ears. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Antti. Thanks, Stephen. Next question in the Q&A is from Ray Huff, and it says, Jason seems to be inferring validity in the emission rates when we've seen that the emission rates from flyovers can be up to 70%. That was not mentioned. Also, the lesson learned from landfills stated that landfills were area-wide sources when the evaluation did not conclude that. So I'll take this one. Ray, you bring up a really good point that when we use the plume mapping technology, like shown in my presentation, it doesn't directly measure emissions. It measures methane concentrations. And similar to what Matthias had shown, to get from concentration to estimates of emissions, you have to take into account things like meteorology, like wind speed is the primary one. So there's also a little bit of magic involved in doing that. And as a penalty in doing that, there is a lot of uncertainty. So using these plume images, we can, or scientists can estimate emission rates, but there is a lot of uncertainty. And as you point out, sometimes that uncertainty can be quite large, up to 70%. So you're absolutely right that that's something that also plays into this with the plume mapping technology. Nonetheless, we still believe that they're really good as a qualitative tool for pointing out where issues might be happening on a landfill or at some other kind of source, and potentially allocating more resources to dealing with the problem there. But you're right, the quantitative part of this is there are a couple of issues as you rightly raise. And then the second part you asked about lesson learned from landfills stated that landfills were area-wide sources when the evaluation did not conclude that. The evaluations really focused on landfills where plumes were detected. As mentioned, we detected plumes at 32 waste disposal sites of the 439 that were sampled. And you know, the evaluations and the reports I think that you're referring to are rightly going to focus on those 32 where plumes were detected. But those other ones where plumes weren't detected are also important. And these kind of demonstrates that the majority of waste disposal sites in California may not have plume detections and may emit more so as an area-wide source where we might not be able to see emissions with these sort of plume mapping technologies. So Ray, I hope that answers the question to your satisfaction. If you have any follow-ups, again, please feel free to post in the Q&A. Next question in the Q&A is from Anonymous, and it says, what would be an example of emissions detected that can't be repaired? I can take this one. Again, thank you for this question. It's a really good question. So as I pointed out, about half of the incidences that were shared between CARB and landfill operators resulted in actions that led to mitigation of emissions at landfills. The other half is what you're asking about. And oftentimes those were attributed to normal operations. So something like the landfill working phase where waste is actively being disposed of. There could be emissions that come from there. If there's construction or maintenance being performed on a small section of the landfill gas collection system, there could be emissions from there that we can see. So the emissions that were detected that can't be repaired generally fall into that categories like those where they occur while meeting regulatory requirements. I hope that answers that question. And again, if you have follow-up, please feel free to post in the Q&A. I can jump into the next question in the Q&A, which is from Anonymous. And the question is, were these incidence findings compared with operators' records from the most recent required monitoring sweep performed by the landfills? Had the operator found no exceedance during these regulatory monitoring processes before your measurements identified in the incidences? This is a really great question, and it's something that we are very interested in and have just begun to do here at CARB by pairing these plume mapping data with some of these reports that landfill operators put together and submit on a quarterly basis as per the regulations. So we are really interested in looking at this exact thing that you point out, where if we find a plume, can we look at reports that were submitted before and after, so quarter before and quarter after, and see if they also found exceedances in those reports, and how does that kind of thing match up. But we don't really have firm data on that yet. It's something we're just beginning to wrap our heads around here. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Jason, do you want to take a break and we can go back to some hands
Sure.
raised?
We can do
All
that.
right. And for anyone, we can still take questions in the written chat, but you're also welcome to still raise your hand if you want to speak with anyone here. All right, Sam Wade, if you still have a question, I've given you permission to unmute yourself. Oops. Sorry, I missed Sam and now I'm on, I'll come back to Sam. Let's see. I think I'm on Beverly DeShow is who I ended up unmuting. Hi, Beverly, are you there?
Hi, was I able to unmute myself?
Yes, you're on now.
Oh, great. So I started to type them into the chat. Some of the questions that I had were answered, like why not be utilizing the landfill emissions, the methane emissions, as Marina in Central Coast, California has been doing since the mid-80s and running their entire operations on the landfill gas that they're capturing. So the rest of my questions are, is CARB actually going to do anything to, so it's great to gather the data, but is CARB actually going to, does CARB have the ability to do anything to regulate these landfills in terms of their emissions? Are they able to make them comply in some way? And also the next question is, so great work on the landfills. What about the oil well emissions? It seems like they have a great deal, high concentration of emissions. Is CARB actually going to be doing anything about them and actually able to enforce anything?
I can jump in and answer the second part of that question about oil and gas emissions from the remote sensing perspective. We have handled detections of plumes at oil and gas sources in a really similar way to what I had shown for landfills. And again, landfills are the focus of this workshop. But we've gotten similar results in oil and gas as well, where operators were willing to voluntarily work with CARB to go out and search for the source of emissions and mitigate the emissions where possible.
Hey, Jason, let me jump in here too. Yeah. Thanks, Beverly. So just to be clear, we currently have a landfill methane regulation to control landfill methane emissions. And then we also have an oil and gas methane regulation at CARB to control oil and gas methane releases from the production of oil and gas in California. And then the PUC also has a leak abatement program to address leaks that happen from the transmission and distribution system for natural gas. And so we are regulating methane emissions in California, both from landfills and from the oil and gas production and extraction system. And in fact, we also have recently convened an interagency task force comprised of CARB, Department of Conservation, as well as CNRA, to look at how we can improve our oil and gas methane mitigation programs going forward. And this is tied with the governor's recent signature of 1137 on oil and gas extraction activities in California. So really encourage you to just do a quick Google search on methane task force and you'll find the materials. And that's the forum we'll be discussing how we can continue to make progress on oil and gas methane reductions in California.
Yeah, I hope you all don't mind if I jump in here and talk just a little bit more about the landfill methane regulation. I think it's important for folks to be aware of the regulations that exist for landfill methane. So this regulation has been in place since 2010. It was one of the AB 32 discrete early action measures. And what it does is require municipal solid waste landfills to install and operate a gas collection and control system at the soonest possible point in time where they're generating enough methane to sustain a flare or other, type of combustion device to make use of or destroy the methane that's collected. And so landfills that are subject to the LMR have to do quarterly monitoring to look for leaks, both at the surface and at any components that contain methane. And then they also are required to take action to mitigate any leaks that are detected. They remonitor within 10 days after a leak is detected, and they've taken some corrective action. And so those are just a few of the many monitoring and operational and record keeping and reporting requirements under the LMR. So collectively, all of those requirements are designed to ensure that the collection and control systems are maintained and operated in a manner that will minimize methane emissions. So I think a lot of what these studies are helping to do is identify where there are methane emissions that might not otherwise have been detected, and also inform the causes of them.
Jennifer, are there any more hands raised? All right, if no more hands are raised, we can go back to the.
Oh yeah, sorry,
written
I do
Q&A.
have
Oh,
a
no.
few more.
Okay.
My apologies. I was trying to give Sam Wade a chance to ask his question, and I switched to Beverly by mistake. So Sam Wade, if you still have a question for us, I'll give you the option now.
Yeah, I do. Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Sam Wade with the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas. We're the National Trade Association for the RNG industry. And we strongly support pretty much all options that allow for the organic waste methane produced by society's MSW stream to be utilized constructively. And what we've seen in the past is that installation of productive energy use projects does help improve capture rate at existing landfills. And of course, diverting the material from landfills into dedicated AD facilities is also an excellent source of renewable natural gas. So we see this issue from a variety of different perspectives, and we support the technology assessment that's been going on the best ways to detect the leakage rates from the landfills. But we also strongly think that CARB needs to look more seriously at increasing the incentives for productive energy use at the landfills that are already have a lot of waste in place, and also the incentives to build facilities that can process the material diverted from landfills. So we think it's useful and important that CARB take the information they've gathered from these studies and apply it to the existing policies that are out there promoting the use of RNG, including the low carbon fuel standard and utility procurement under Senate Bill 1440. And I'm just wondering if anyone on the CARB team is willing to comment today a little bit about how all this important work on the various methods is going to inform future rulemakings to greater incentivize the use of renewable natural gas.
Matt, do you want to?
Yep, I'm just getting off mute. Yeah, thanks, Sam. Appreciate the comments as always. So I do want to point folks to, and I think Anthony may have made a couple of these comments earlier on, that we have we've released the scoping plan now, and we put it out a couple of weeks ago, and we are holding a board hearing on December 15th. Encourage folks to comment. And in there, we're sending some pretty clear policy signals with respect to the need to continue to deploy infrastructure to build our RNG supplies to meet our growing kind of energy demand in both the transportation and non-transportation sectors. It should be clear, like the low carbon energy demand that we're see needing to grow over time. And so we are being clear that infrastructure, the need for biomethane deployment in various different end uses is something that we see growing over time. And we're going to continue to have those conversations in the policy forums, like the low carbon fuel standard and others, where we can make the adjustments to achieve those energy end goals. And so I just, again, kind of appreciate the feedback and look forward to having those conversations about how we can kind of speed up that transition that we know is necessary. And this data is important data, and it's a source of data that we can look to. It doesn't have to be the only source as we look at what the policy constructs are for encouraging and growing that alternative energy supplies.
Thank you, Matt. Jennifer, do we have more questions live?
I'll let Jason go back to some of the written questions. We still have a collection, and then we'll come back to some hands raised in a little bit.
Sounds good.
Okay, jumping back into Q&A, some written questions. There's a question asking if we can expand about the $100 million California investment in satellites for measuring methane. I see Elizabeth unmuted.
Yeah, I can jump in here, Jason. I'm Elizabeth Shealy. I'm the head of the research division. Really appreciate that question. We did, as Jason mentioned, we, as a state, we are investing $100 million into satellites through the last budget. And we will be doing that, looking at remote sensings from satellites to expand and increase the frequency in the area on which we looked. As Jason also mentioned, there are numerous technologies that are evolving in this space, and we will be concluding this through a competitive bid process as well. And if you have any additional questions, happy to answer that.
All right, thank you for that question, and thank you, Elizabeth, for the response. Moving down the list here, there's a question from Dylan Smith about what are the effects of landfill topology and topography on the measurement methodologies and technologies. And this is a great question about measurement methodology, and where topology and topography really come into play is anytime we're making measurements on the surface of the landfill. You can imagine when we, like Matthias had shown, the mobile platform that we can use to sometimes measure methane on landfills. Well, we can only drive that on areas that are accessible. Same thing with any kind of foot-based survey or foot-based measurements. You can only conduct those on parts of the landfill that are accessible. So many times it excludes areas that are physically dangerous, like steep slopes, or areas that are physically being worked on at the moment, like the open face. So some of these more remote technologies, like the plume mapping technologies or the scientific aviation flights that Matthias had shown, are attractive for that reason, that they don't require us to set foot on landfills, and we can sort of get around this issue of topology and topography. Matthias, would you like to add more?
Yeah, I just want to add a few things to that. I had mentioned during the eddy covariance slides that that method really requires a flat or flattish surface. So we're limited, in areas that have steep slope. This technology isn't as applicable, and like we have landfills that are located in canyons and other things. So each method really has some limitations that come in by California's topography. Even the airborne measurements, if we have landfills located in steep canyons, it can be difficult to fly a control volume, particularly under certain wind conditions. When we have these strong downwind canyon events, like the Santa Ana winds, it can be really, really difficult and virtually impossible to fly the aircraft. So, like we have to work within the limitations that are set by the natural environment, and all these technologies and measurement approaches have their own limitations when it comes to that. So landfills definitely don't make it easy to apply these technologies, and that's why we're still here talking about really developing a framework for the future.
All right, thank you for that question, and thank you, Matthias, for assisting in the answer. There's another question from Anonymous. Has CARB utilized gas detection cameras for methane detection and quantification at landfills? And if so, what was the result? I can speak to this from the research side of things, and the answer is no. We do not use gas detection cameras on landfills. Similar to the plume mapping instruments, with the cameras, you're really limiting yourself to areas that have really high, or localized sources that have really high levels of emissions. And you're also coupling with that with all of the limitations like topography and topology that were raised in the last question. You can't use the camera on places that you can't access on foot. So for those reasons, it's not part of our routine portfolio for doing research on landfills. And if anyone else has anything more they'd like to add, feel free to, but that's the research side of things. If not, we can move on to the next question, which comes from Stephen Rosenblum. And this might be for a question for Matt. Under LCFS, it seems that methane recovered from dairy manure has much higher credits than methane recovered from landfill gas. What is the reason for this?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So this kind of goes back to some of the other questions that Yaniv and Sam had also asked, and it has to do with how we treat landfill gas under the LCFS versus dairy methane. And so we do have higher avoided methane crediting under the dairy projects comparatively to the landfill projects, because the landfill projects are assumed to have some existing methane capture that happens on those landfills, given the implementation of our landfill methane regulation. And so getting into estimates about, what would the methane emissions coming off of landfills be, but for kind of the implementation of a LCFS project requires us to kind of analyze what those avoided methane emissions would be under landfills versus dairies. And because the dairies are uncontrolled, we assume that there are higher methane emissions coming off of those dairies, relatively speaking.
All right, thanks, Matt, and thanks, Stephen, for the question. There's another question in the Q&A. Which feedstocks contribute the most to methane production besides organic waste? Does anyone on the panel have an answer for that question?
Ante, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. So our best understanding is that methane is generated from the decomposition of organic waste. So carbon that's in organic waste, gets digested by microbes in the anaerobic conditions, and that's what results in the release of methane emissions. So if you're looking for methane emissions that are not coming from organic waste at a landfill, I don't think that there are any such categories. Of course, there can be situations where landfills are located near another source of methane emissions, like some oil and gas operations, or even, things like wetlands or other natural sources of methane emissions. But in landfills, it's certainly the organic waste. So foods, paper, wood, all those types of organic waste contain carbon that's digestible by microbes. So hopefully that clears that up.
Thank you, Auntie, and thanks for the question. Maybe we can take one more and then we can move back to the raised hands. Does that sound good, Jennifer? So next question is, in the Bay Area, we have seen significant methane emissions from composting operations. Has there been any research into this? From a purely research side of things, we know that as 1383 continues to expand in the coming years, composting operations are something we may want to keep an eye on. To date, we haven't done a lot of research specifically at composting operations. Part of the California Methane Survey did fly over some compost facilities in California, but again, that was 2016 through 2018. So we haven't done a ton of recent research estimating emissions from composting facilities, but it is something that's on our radar for sure. Thank you for the question. Jennifer, do you want to move into, I think I saw a couple of hands that went up recently. Do you want to open those up?
Yes, I have one hand raised. Oh, now I have two. First hand raiser is Nick Lapis. I'm going ahead and give you permission to speak with us now.
Good afternoon, Nick Lapis with Californians Against Waste. I put my question more or less in the Q&A, so I'm cheating a little bit by raising my hand as well. But just maybe to summarize, I was very heavily involved in the original implementation of AB 32, including the early action measure, the greenhouse gas inventory, the mandatory reporting regulations, all of that. And at the time, a lot of the decisions that were made were based on imperfect data. And it seems like we have much better data now on multiple different strategies that we had discussed extensively back then. And I guess my question is, what is the plan for actually using this data? I keep hearing we need more research, we need to have discussions internally, but will there be an opportunity for stakeholders to maybe, at a workshop or at some kind of more collaborative forum, actually talk about what tools you currently have and how they could be adjusted based on the information we have?
Hey, Nick, thanks for the comment. Yeah, so, what we really wanted to do today was really bring out all of the great work that the research division, that ISD and others have done here to help us get a better handle on landfill methane emissions. Recognize it's been too long since we've had an opportunity like this to kind of bring all of this out into the public dialogue. So as far as your questions about, having follow-on workshops, I appreciate the feedback. We'll definitely take that back. I do want to flag that, many of these efforts, or many of the things that are going on right now within individual programs, there are also areas to engage on. So obviously, I talked a little bit earlier about the scoping plan and the signals called for, pushing forward on organic diversion, as well as, RNG production as part of the scoping plan. And we're having that board hearing on the 15th. And then the LCFS has started an informal pre-rulemaking series of workshops where we're discussing what adjustments could be made to the low carbon fuel standard that could help get us to our 2030 and post 2030 greenhouse gas goals. So we're having those discussions going on in those individual forums, and then welcome additional feedback on this workshop. And then we'll take this back about opportunities to continue the conversation on landfills and point taken about the time at which we've had the landfill methane regulation on the books for, and the opportunities that there are for looking at that again. So again, just, appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, I appreciate that response. And again, if we can find a venue for advocates, academics, other folks to come together and talk through this with you, I think there might be more opportunities you're not necessarily thinking of. And again, I think back to the mandatory reporting regulations, where there was no direct measurement required of landfills because some of this research was in its early days, and the plan was to see how it turned out first. Similarly with the landfill gas regulation, it was constantly referred to in the regulation as phase 1, and there were constant references to phase 2 and phase 3 of the regulations, which have never happened. So thank you again for putting this on.
Yeah, and I do want to flag too that this is why we're doing this multi-divisional workshop, right? We've got representatives from the Industrial Strategies Division here, myself included, that oversee some of the incentive programs, as well as the landfill methane regulation on the line. We've got representatives from Research Division that have taken this research prerogative and done much of this in terms of the studies and the data collection, and then also representatives from our air quality planning and science division that work on the inventory. So, we're bringing this forward in terms of a multi-divisional approach towards how we can look at landfill methane emissions and kind of where we go from here. So I just appreciate the feedback, and you've got the folks on the line listening and participating on this that are all kind of touch on these individual aspects of it. Jennifer?
Yep. Okay. Thank you, Nick. I have one more hand raised. It looks like Stephen Rosenblum has another question for us. Stephen, did you want to speak with us?
Yeah, thanks for giving me another shot. Really appreciate your putting up with my questions. I had a follow-up question from Matt Boto on the LCFS. I've been following the stuff on my email that comes in from the Tier 2 pathway applications from dairy manure operations. I just got one from a dairy in Wisconsin that wants to convert its manure methane to liquid hydrogen and then ship it to California for vehicle fuel. I think what we're encouraging is a manure land rush with the LCFS credits. And I really think that, it'd be much better for CARB to offer higher credits for landfills to beneficiate their gas and put it into the pipe system than they would to encourage dairy farmers to increase their herd size. So I really would encourage CARB to take another look at the particularly the assumptions underlining the LCFS and see that it doesn't perversely encourage dairy farmers to produce more manure and more methane. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and appreciate the follow-up. So a couple of just quick points that I want to make here, which is, one, we have an overarching set of requirements, a law that we have to meet, which is the SB 1383 requirements that I mentioned earlier, that a number of folks have alluded to in terms of requirements that we reduce our methane emissions in California 40% below 2013 levels by 2030, and also in 1383 requirements on diverting landfill organics in 2025. And so, the state is moving forward on the strategies to meet those statutory targets. And that means, both reducing methane from, I should say, not just both, but reducing methane from landfills, from dairies, and from oil and gas infrastructure. And we're using tools like the LCFS to do it. We had a discussion back in March, a workshop that was specific to dairy methane, to ask these questions about how was the state's policies affecting kind of the dairy industry more broadly. We had various representatives from USDA, from the advocacy community, from industry, and from the scientific community come to give presentations on dairy biomethane crediting. So I'd encourage you to take a look at some of those materials. They're on our CARB's website and available there to understand kind of what's happening with respect to the dairy industry. And then, when it comes to the piece about encouraging and incentivizing landfill reductions, we haven't really talked much about it here. I don't know if anybody's actually mentioned it, but we're all working kind of collaboratively with the PUC and as they work forward on implementing SB 1440, which is a renewable natural gas procurement mandate for the utilities, and it's focused heavily on supporting the procurement of renewable natural gas from landfill diverted organics through the 1440 process. And so this is all to say that there are a number of tools that the state is deploying to get at our statutory targets of methane reductions beyond the study of the emissions that were not really the subject of today's workshop, but I felt obliged to just put on the table so folks are aware of them. All right, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to let Jason go back to some of the written questions, and we'll come back to people with their hands raised in a minute.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. So there's a question from Beverly Deschaux here. Does utilizing captured methane, i.e. burning it, result in CO2 emissions, which has longer term GHG heating capacity? So is any gain made, or in that effect, are we just pushing the problem down the road? Jorn, would you like to take this one since it ties in with some of the slides that you had shared?
Sure, I can do that. Yeah, you are correct. When you burn methane, you get CO2, and that's where the relative amount of warming of the same amount of the two come into play. Both molecules have one carbon atom, and so one measure of methane turns into one measure of carbon. And so that's where the GWP comes in, and really the one to use probably is a 20-year GWP, which is 86. So by burning methane, you reduce the overall warming to the atmosphere by a factor of 86. And so that's what we're trying to do. And if you burn it and you use it for something, now you're also displacing other carbons, that potentially fossil fuels that would have been burnt instead as well. So you don't reduce the greenhouse gas effect by 100% by burning methane, but by, I'm not sure exactly what I ended up being, but like 97% or something like that. So it's still very, very beneficial to collect it and to use it.
Okay, thank you, Jorn. There's a question from Nicole Dickerson. For local air agency inspectors, should we be using handheld sensors when we do our inspections and reporting information to CARB? Unfortunately, we don't have anyone from our enforcement division online, but maybe Antti or Matt, if you're able to answer this question. If not, we can always get back to you at a later point.
Sorry, I missed the question. Could you repeat that?
Sure. Antti, the question is for local air agency inspectors, should we be using handheld sensors when we do our inspections and reporting information to CARB?
Oh, I see. So that may be something best followed up on offline. For operators, there's a method that's required. It's EPA's method 21 for their inspections. But for air agency inspectors, there may be more options that we could discuss. Now, I've got another question here that I'd like to answer. So this was an anonymous participant wanted to know about how our targets for reducing organic disposal in landfills will impact the economics of existing landfill gas to energy projects. And we did a little bit of projecting of that for the scoping plan. So under the time frame, between now and 2045, that 75% expected reduction in organic waste disposal is only expected to decrease the quantity of gas that is collected in statewide landfill gas control systems by about 10 or maybe 15%. And that's because, and we have some great context on this as well in the full scoping plan report, but that's really because of the amount of degradable carbon that's in landfills today, right? And when you compare that, amount of carbon that's been disposed over decades and has, been slowly decomposing to form methane and CO2 from landfills, if you compare that to the amount that's added each year, that carbon stock that's there existing, already disposed in landfills is much, much greater. And so, starting now, as we reduce the amount that we're adding each year, we're not really going to see major reductions in the ability for collection systems to, get enough gas to be useful for a long, long time. And again, I'll reiterate that we're only using about 1/3 of our collected gas today for a beneficial use. And so I think there's, other economic issues and barriers aside from the diversion efforts that we're starting to undertake. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Antti. Jen, it looks like there's 2 hands up in the chat. Do we want to maybe take a break from the written Q&A and answer those?
Yes, sure. Idan Prabhu, did you have another question for us?
Yes, thank you. This is not really a landfill question, but it's a methane question. We are converting landfill and other gas to renewable natural gas. On the same basis, we are also doing our best to eliminate natural gas. First of all, is there somebody working on resolving this conflict? Shouldn't we, see, if you're going all electric, shouldn't we give the incentives to landfill gas and other gas to electric? Otherwise, we'll have electric cars and we'll have natural gas and they won't fit together. Something is missing in the big picture.
Hey, Eden, this is Matt Botel. I can take this question. I think it's a good one, and it also gets us into a little bit more specifics about how the captured biomethane is currently being used and could be used into the future. Right now, landfill captured gas, the organic diverted gas that is generated from AD, as well as biomethane that's captured from dairies, for instance, for dairy manure. Much of it is flowing to the transportation sector to be used as a transportation fuel, because there are incentives through things like the low carbon fuel standard to allow it to be deployed there, and because there are some of the existing CNG vehicles that can be deployed to use that fuel. But one of the things that we flagged in the state scoping plan to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045 is that there is also an opportunity for transition of the vehicle fleet, including the light duty, medium, and heavy duty vehicle fleet, will be moving towards zero emission vehicles over time. There will still be some legacy vehicles that persist with liquid fuel demand in those vehicle fleets over time, but it will transition to zero emission vehicles like you mentioned. And we still will have a significant amount of demand for liquid and gaseous fuels in the remaining sectors like the commercial and industrial sectors and residential sectors throughout California as we transition to carbon neutrality between now and 2045. And so we see opportunities for biomethane, captured biomethane, to be deployed in other sectors, either directly as a replacement for fossil gas that's currently being used in those sectors, or as a feedstock for things like hydrogen production or electricity production to fuel the vehicles that you mentioned earlier, the zero emission vehicles that we're transitioning to over time. So this is all to say that there's opportunities for deployment of that fuel, and it also comes with the very clear benefit and kind of purpose of reducing methane emissions in California, which we need to do via statute. So I'd encourage you to take a look at the scoping plan and look at some of the end uses that we've identified for biomethane, including hydrogen and industrial uses, to get a sense of how we can move from use as just a transportation fuel in the current context to other end uses.
Isn't the electricity going to be doubled when we have all the cars running on electricity?
So the scoping plan also projects out what the electricity load growth will be as we move to higher amounts of electrification, not just for the transportation sector, but also for buildings. We have an almost doubling of electricity generation capacity between now and 2045 to meet that load growth. And then we also put forward some projections on the need to really expand the renewable capacity as well, solar and wind, for instance, to meet that electricity demand.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
That was great. I'm going to become friends with you, Matt.
The more the merrier at this point, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have one more hand raised. We'll get to you in just a minute. Yaniv Sherson, do you have a question for us?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So Matt, as one of the many friends here, question for you. Following on the 1440 comment, so painting the landscape, 1383 requires the most ambitious organics diversion mandate, I think we've ever seen in our country. Something like 100 digesters, more or less, will be needed in state. And I think what's been very fascinating about this data presentation, and we're greatly appreciative, is that I think what we've concluded fairly clearly is that the current landfill capture rate is based on information from the late 90s. And we're fortuitous today to have much more robust data set with technology that's giving a much more accurate picture, where I think the clear consensus is landfills emit more methane than previously thought and modeled. And that seems to be a consensus we see on publications around the world, including a lot of the great work Carbon Mapper is doing, nationally and globally. Other states are concluding the same thing, like the flagship study in Maryland as well. Landfills emitting 3 times what was thought. EPA confirming on record that landfills are believed to emit at least twice as much. And all this to say that both approaches are needed to enhance landfill capture, to the point of Chuck's comments, but also to advance the science. And we strongly endorse, as the owner and operator of California's largest organics diversion digester, updating the science and doing so on a continual basis. So it's not a static point in time, just like the science is evolving, so should the landfill capture rate on, say, 5-year cycles. That would be the most accurate. So we're always up to date on the science, and not living in the 90s on data. And the reason why this is so critical is 1440, as you know, is a CI-based procurement standard, particularly because all of the applications we believe will be in the tier 3 category. The reason for that is we see in the evidence that when the CI score is sufficiently negative, it's a great economic incentive for RNG facilities, like we've seen the boom in the dairy space, and it's been great. We've successfully increased substantially low carbon RNG because for the dairy sector, RNG has been properly incentivized. For the organic diversion sector, it has not. And we see that the resulting CI scores in California, to my knowledge, there's one food scraps pathway, which is not a standalone digester. And there's a reason. That's exactly the reason. There's not a sufficient incentive. So we're going to be facing a challenging task to build 100 food waste digesters in the state when both LCFS and 1440 that will establish a pricing mechanism based on CI, which is in part of a formula for social cost of carbon, are both grossly undervaluing the actual methane mitigation and reduction. So all this to say that we strongly encourage, to the points of Sam and to the points of Nick as well, updating the science on a continual basis. A, because that's the right thing to do for scientific integrity, as we've seen today with this groundbreaking research. And two, because it keenly aligns with California policy. And the 1440 and the LCFS program will not properly incentivize organic diversion digesters without increasing the economic incentive, which is linearly proportional to the CI score. So I just wanted to put that kind of very directly on the record for your consideration and for the broader audience here that's at the forefront of the policy decision. And I say that because, I don't want to underscore, 1440's pricing mechanism is directly referencing the tier 1 calculator, and the CI score in 1440 will be identical around the -50 zone for food waste when, the dairy space we see at a -300 has a material impact on actually making facilities happen.
Thanks, Yaniv. So really appreciate the comments. Welcome you along the big group of friends. So I just a couple of points real quickly. I want to acknowledge that, and we're gonna post the slides here too. Looking to get them up tomorrow. I recognize that there's a lot of information on these slides. There's a lot shared this workshop, and we're recording the workshop, so it'll be available so people can kind of go back and reference it. But one of the things I wanted to point out was, for instance, like on the Cal Poly studies, we did see a fair bit of variability, and it's difficult to make the conclusion that all landfills across all California are emitting more than modeled, and that will come through in some of the data that we show, and that'll be in the slides for instance, from the Cal Poly studies. So it is hard to make these broad brushed assumptions about all landfills being higher emitting than what was modeled. But that being said, point taken, and understanding kind of the relationships between 1440 and the tier 1 calculators that LCFS has established, and hopeful that with this information, with the slides out there, we can have conversations about kind of what does it mean in terms of relation back to what we've established under the LCFS for the tier 1 calculators as we think about going forward, and the availability of data and how we use it. So appreciate it. Jennifer?
Jason, are you ready with some more of the written questions?
Yeah, we can jump into that. So I'll give Matt a break here, and we can go with this question of what's the significance of using a GWP of 100 versus 20 years? Is it somewhat arbitrary, or given the imminent rates of warming and severity of climate change, does it make sense to use the more conservative timescale, in this case, 20 years? Jorn or Elizabeth, would you guys like to take this one?
I can take that one. Yeah, and for inventory purposes, the standard is that you use 100-year global warming potential. That's how it's done worldwide. That's how it's required to be done by the UN. And so that's what's being used there. for this whole paradigm of, reducing short-lived climate pollutants to get reduction in warming now, between now and 2050, really using the 20-year global warming potential makes a lot more sense. And they are difficult animals, and that's why we try to include those graphs that we had in our presentation about what's actually going on, because just the global warming potential themselves are, they don't tell the whole story. So it really depends a little bit on your purpose. If you want to be able to compare inventories across all jurisdictions in the entire world, you need everyone to be doing it the same way. Otherwise, things are not comparable and you can't track changes over time. And so again, 100-year global warming potential is being used for that purpose. But for kind of achieving some of these shorter term goals of getting reductions in warming now, the 20-year global warming potential is really better.
All right, thank you, Jorn. There's another question, I think, unless Elizabeth, did you have anything you wanted to add on that as follow-up?
I just wanted to add that there are different ways to look at the global warming potential. It is really important that we look at it consistently as an agency, and that we look at it consistently using the 100 years, like is done with the IPCC guidelines, as well as a national inventory that really does allow us to be consistent and compare across sources. So just wanted to add a little bit on that.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. Jorn and Elizabeth, this next question might be up your alley as well. From Anonymous, would satellite scanning be aimed at identifying clandestine emitters in the future for regulation/enforcement?
Well, there's a number of the satellites that we will be launching. We will be focusing mainly on areas where we know there's infrastructure that might be emitting, or that we know emit methane, and the majority of the observational capacity of those satellites will be used for that. But we're definitely open to input, and we definitely don't want to leave any stone unturned. And so from time to time, we will probably be using a little bit of the observational capacity to look at things that might surprise us, I guess I'll say, just to make sure.
All right, wanted to do a quick time check. We do have about 6 minutes left, I think, before the workshop ends. Jennifer, there's 2 hands that just came up. Would you mind going to the live questions?
Yes.
Then we can try to answer what we can in the chat.
Yep,
with
that's
text.
fine. So I'm going to call on Muriel Strand, if you would like to speak with us.
Hi, yeah, I submitted a written question, but it might have gotten lost. So I'm just curious, what is known now about the methane emissions from plastics in landfills?
So I guess the question is, they're not the only was it? Not analyzed.
Anthony, I think you took the previous question about methane emissions from plastics. Would you mind jumping in here again?
Sure, yeah. So we don't assume that plastics decompose in landfills. The degradation rates of plastic, certainly vary, and I may not be up to speed on the very latest science, but certainly, what I've heard and read over the years is that plastics can persist for hundreds and thousands and even tens of thousands of years for some types and in certain environments. So, for the time being, our assumptions, our emission estimates don't include any degradation of plastics into methane.
Okay, thanks. Sorry if I missed the earlier answer.
No, that's all right. It was less specific than your question. So thanks for bringing it up.
Jennifer, it looks like Eden also has his hand up. Would you mind?
Yes, I will get to him right now.
Thank you.
Okay, this is my last question, I promise. Who is watching wetlands methane? It seems like 30 to 50% of the methane is coming out of wetlands. And I haven't heard anyone do anything about that. It was once used as fuel many decades ago.
Hey, Dan and Matt again. So I'm going to point you back to the work that we were doing on the scoping plan. Historically, CARBs in the state of California's greenhouse gas mitigation targets have been just that. They've been mitigation targets targeted at the reduction of emissions from our use of essentially fossil energy. And more recently, with the passage of AB 1279 in the legislature this year, this was in September, and it was signed by Governor Newsom, the state established net zero targets by 2045 or carbon neutrality targets by 2045 as we think about them. And so with that, we have now been doing deeper assessments on emissions from natural working lands, wetlands included, and identifying strategies to reduce those emissions from wetlands. And predominantly methane production comes from degraded wetlands, but also from restored wetlands, depending on things like salinity and water availability. And so as part of the scoping plan work that we did in looking at carbon neutrality, we actually included estimates of methane emissions from wetlands, and now we are also targeting reductions for those methane emissions, and recognizing that we are not going to eliminate all wetland methane emissions in California, so we're going to need things like carbon dioxide removal to compensate for some of those emissions. Encourage you to take a look at the scoping plan and all of the technical details. I think there's like 300 pages on just natural working lands modeling alone that you can pour through. So thank you for the question.
Okay.
And Jennifer, Jason, looks like we have time for one more question. So if you want to give us our last one.
Sure. Sorry, Matt. Okay, so there's a few questions in the chat. We can do this one from Anonymous. Given that our understanding of the detrimental impacts of landfill emissions has come a long way since 2010 when the rule became effective, when is CARB going to consider amending their LMR to make it more effective addressing and reducing these emissions with what we know now?
Sure, happy to take this one. So we talked a little bit about this earlier in terms of the implementation of the landfill methane regulation, but one of the things I want to make clear is that we are working very closely with CalRecycle on understanding progress towards implementing the organics diversion targets in 1383, because that will have, as Anthony mentioned earlier, a really big impact on what the methane generation from landfills will be going forward. And so we're keeping a close eye on kind of how implementation is going. And then we also put some signaling in the scoping plan that there may be additional opportunities for landfill methane mitigation going forward, and tools that we can look at deploying. And so we know that we have some work to do on the landfill methane regulation, and that would be coming up in the future. So welcome feedback on options there through the scoping plan process. And like any scoping plan, once we get it through the board and have approval, we then start looking at what kinds of regs should we open and when should we do it. And that would be starting in the coming years. So. All right, who is closing us out? Is it Jorn? Jason, who's doing it?
Well, we can do it collectively. I was going to say a few words. Just want to thank everyone for tuning in today. It's been a great discussion, and wanted to also thank all the speakers and Jennifer and Maureen, who's been helping us run the Zoom part of the meeting. Work continues. Obviously, we have more to do, and hope to continue the conversation with you all. So, Matt, Elizabeth, do either of you want to say something?
I will just add my thanks to everybody for attending and providing feedback. As you can see, we've been doing a lot of research over the last several years and more, and we'll continue to do so. I think one of the things you saw from all of the presentations were the limitations and the snapshot in time sort of aspect, and really encourage you to look through all of the presentations once they're online, and get back to us with any feedback. But really appreciate your time here, and any ideas as we move forward as well on additional research that we can do as we move forward on this area. Thank you.
Yeah. And I just want to, I'll throw in something too. I just want to say thank you to the research division team too. I mean, the presentations today really represent years worth of work to get a better handle on methane emissions in California, not just from landfills, but across the board. And so, it's a significant lift, and it really is really very important work that is helping us in our mitigation approaches. So I just appreciate everybody's time and energy for participating in the workshop, and in research division in particular for the work they've gone into studying this issue. So thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Jorn. All right, and I think that's it for us for today. I appreciate everybody's time, and we'll be following up. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.